Where do you think practically India will be in the next 10 years?
Let me put it this way. I think we're in a soft spot at the moment, because I think over the 30-year period, the country has got used to the idea that things must change, there must be reforms, there must be progress, etc. I personally think that it won't be very difficult for India to grow at about 6 or 6+%. But if you like, the explosion of expectations is such that 6+% will not satisfy the expectations that have been raised. Remember, we have widely expanded education. Now, it's all very well to say that a lot of the people who have BA degrees are not employable, and you blame the universities. But people also say that all these chaps are very easily given the last mile training, and therefore you have to do something. There's no question that on the human capital side, we are much better placed than we were 20 years ago. But it's not as if we are bursting at the seams with people who can be brought in straight away into global capability centers. So I think we need to aim over the next 10 years at something like 7.5%, which I don't think is currently the underlying trend growth rate. So we need to decide how are we going to handle this problem. One of the things we absolutely have to do is be clear about is that, do we believe that this will require a dynamic private sector, or do we believe that we can do all this through public investment? I sometimes hear people nowadays saying कि भाई अगर private sector invest नहीं कर रहा है तो क्या हर्ज है public sector कर देगा. This would be an unbelievable mistake. But if you want a dynamic private sector, you need to encourage things like startups. You need to do a huge amount on ease of doing business. You need to do a huge amount on minimum government, maximum governance, which I think is a good slogan, but it hasn't actually been implemented. What's his name? Manish Sabarwal was telling me, because he'd done some work, and he said that, even in the central government, there are, 15,000 provisions in various laws which attract a criminal penalty. And they had recommended that we should drastically cut them down. But finally, they did recommend to the central government that at least 5,000 need not be a criminal penalty. And so a lot of work was done. But in the end, only 100 were removed. So, this is typically what happens, that you give a signal at the top, but the bureaucracy doesn't necessarily care. I'd give the same recommendation to Amrinder Singh in Punjab, that your state government has far too many penalties that are criminal, and these just become a source of harassment for the private sector. I mean, he said to me that, look, I know some of the recommendations you're going to make, like free power for farmers and all. Politically, I can't do it. I said, okay, I recognize that. You handle that problem separately. But there's no political problem in this. And I said, if you manage to do 80% of what we are recommending in this area, I think you'll make a big difference. Well, of course, he was moved out, so he didn't stay for that long. But subsequent governments haven't implemented that. And I personally feel that too much focus today is on what the central government should do. The truth of the matter is that on all these things, ease of doing business, harassment, dealing with people, they're all in the realm of state governments. And I think I would hope that 10 years from now, we are able to show conclusively that out of 30 states or whatever it is that we have now, at least 15 have made a dramatic change in these areas. If you do that, you will also find that these are the states that have grown, because these are the states that will attract investment. And the solution should not be to give money to the states that have not grown. The solution should be to benchmark their policies against the policies of the successful states and tell them, why don't you do this? I think we need that. But it can only happen if it becomes part of state-level politics, local understanding on the part of voters. And the big tension will be between that and trying to get local support through freebies, which is actually very popular. Now, if you go down that route, I don't think we should not expect even 6.5% growth. But if we don't go down that route, and a lot of that depends on what happens in state government, not just the center, then I think, we should be able to do 7, whatever it is. That may not get us to developed country status by 2047. I mean, that requires about 8.5% real growth. But, whether we do it in 2047 or 2053, the important thing is, are we making the structural changes needed between now and then so that people will say, it's working, and we can then speed it up?
Because India has an advantage which is in narrative right now. It's not happening in real. That, China is almost shunned by the global investment fraternity right now because of various reasons. I'll not go into this podcast. But the next alternative that people are thinking about is India. And India is a promising land and has been a promising land for the last 20 years. But people have to see it in action.
No, I don't think we should. I have no idea how the global geopolitical tension will evolve. It's not difficult to imagine that if there are certain changes in Chinese policy, they may lead to certain changes in Western policy that will create a little bit of a closure on this point. You're right. Right now, the Chinese do not seem to be indicating any change. And therefore, we have an opportunity, maybe for the next 5, maybe 10 years. If we respond in the right direction, people will respond towards India very positively. But sometimes I hear that people will come to India because there's nowhere else to go. This is wrong. Because, after all of East Asia is a highly integrated economy with zero tariffs. And that's a very large, potentially quite a large market. So actually, we are competing with Southeast Asia. They have their own problems, but all told, people judge that they're doing a better job than we are. Although people also realize that if we can get our act together, then there are things that we can offer which they can't. But will we get our act together? That's what you have to advise all your colleagues, because this is what younger people have to do.
Yeah. India can at least aim towards becoming free market like Singapore, with the ease of coming in of money and going out of money, and Singapore has been able to do it.
I want to slightly differ with you on that. I mean, Singapore has done a fantastic job for the circumstances they had. If you were that small and you were living in a continent where everybody was closed, it's a no-brainer that you should be open, and simply being an entrepot would give you a fantastic advantage. And I mean, in order to continue that, you also need to invest hugely in human capital, which Lee Kuan Yew did. You also have to invest hugely in improving the quality of cities, which Lee Kuan Yew did. The notion that Singapore is an example of free market, this is actually a mistake. The Singaporean government is far more intrusive than other governments. They can do it because it's a city state, and they know more about what every individual is doing or saying than any other government can. They're not an example of a free market. They are an example of a free financial system. That's absolutely true. I'm not sure that we need to emulate them. In that respect, I think the approach of having a gift city, maybe we can have a couple more, because it shouldn't just be concentrated in one area. Having a couple more gift cities so that that part of the economy that needs to interact more freely is able to do so. See, remember, India is still, half of India is at a level of development which is not very different from what the country was, let's say, on average in 1991. The other half has moved forward. When I say half, you might say 40%, whatever. That's the point. So I think that the Indian state has to define the role for itself, and it's not a zero role. In certain areas, we need to expand the state. For example, we don't have enough judges, we don't have enough policemen, we don't have enough nurses, we don't have enough doctors in rural areas, and we don't have enough sanitary workers, etc., etc. We have too many clerks. So really, government has to manage its resources so that it creates the right kind of jobs and either restricts or closes some of the not so necessary jobs. It also needs to create a system where the incentive to work is there. If a teacher is hired, I mean, in many parts of the country today, when a teacher is hired, the teacher is being paid 5 times the market rate. So all that the teacher does, it hires somebody else to do his work and sit at home. Because basically the local community doesn't have control over the teacher to the extent that it should. Massive decentralization is needed. This is not a central government issue. This is a state government issue. All our states complain that they're not getting enough decentralization between the center and the states, which is true. But none of them pay any attention to the fact that as far as the rest of the thing is concerned, they have to decentralize locally. I mean, within the state. So these are the things now, and of course, underneath all this, there's climate change, which raises all these problems. Where the resources are going to come from, who's going to manage them, blah, blah, blah. I personally think that long-term problems are best condensed into workable 10-year problems.
Okay.
So, yes, we'll aim somewhere. Many things are not disputable. Yes, so we endorse all that. In the next 10 years, what are we going to do? And I think if the government were to make up its mind that, look, it has been doing all these things, and in the next 10 years, it's going to shrink its focus to half of these things, that would be a huge problem. These half, while shrunk in numbers, will involve a widening of the role of the state. And that's correct. We should do that. So I think we need, the debate needs to shift on to this. This cannot, in my view, be done purely within the government. This needs to bring in business, think tanks, NGOs, civil society, political parties.
Yeah. So what I understand from you is what government did in 1991 to open up the central economy. Each state needs to build up their own committees or their own bodies to literally liberalize the state.
Absolutely. I think there's no question in my mind that we need to do that. In fact, by focusing too much on the center, and this happened during the UPA, all the NGO types, on the one hand, they were very much in favor of decentralizing. But on the other hand, they wanted the central government to give directions. None of them were willing to say, leave it to the states. They said, this is what the states should do, and you should have guidelines which tell the states to do it. And the states would say, look, this is not right. We are responsible. We are going back to our own population to get voted. So you let us decide all this, and you have a much more limited role. I think if we can get a better understanding, a political understanding, that one, the state has to do more, but the state must shrink the area in which it intervenes, that it must make life a lot easier for the private sector. And that very often requires getting rid of innumerable useless regulations. I think we'll make a lot of progress.